Lenson? Lenson? Hello! Hello! Thank you for being here. It's a good Sunday afternoon for me, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is for you. Hello, Jess. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here as always. I gotta get the TikTok live started. Almost forget to hit that. Okay. I'm so glad everyone is here. Now, if you were with me, well, not last week, 2 weeks ago, because I took a break, then you know that we're on part two. Hello, Benny. We're on part two of a lecture on the history of the circus. Now, if you weren't here, or if you just don't remember because it's been too long, it's no worries. This works pretty well standalone, so don't worry you're going to be too terribly lost or anything. But we're going to cover the beginnings of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus up through to the present day after it closed and sort of where we're at now. Looks like we've got a few people in here, so I think I'm more or less ready to go ahead and get started. Like I said, I'm so glad you're all here with me today. So let's pick up where we left off last time with the rise and fall of the so-called greatest show on Earth. So last time we talked a little bit about the big names in circus that you know, Barnum and the Ringling Brothers and even Buffalo Bill. One man we haven't talked about yet is James A. Bailey, where we're the other half of Barnum and Bailey. So Bailey is born James Anthony McGinnis in Detroit in 1847, and he's really, if not the most famous, one of the most famous cases of running away with the circus. He was an orphan at age 8, and his older sister abused him, so he ran away from home. And at first he worked in a hotel and did some other odd jobs. But then a circus advance man, which is one of the advertising guys for a circus, whose name was Frederick Bailey, took James under his wing. And so James actually even took this man's name. He was so happy to have a mentor in his life. Now, James Bailey was very, very good at management. And so he sort of rose through the ranks of the circus because he was so good at what he did. And by his mid-20s, he was already a partner in his own show. And this circus got big enough to tour not only the U.S., but much of South America, Australia, New Zealand, Java. They tour all over the place, this show that he manages. So he's risen to the ranks faster than most people do. It's really pretty astounding how quickly he does this, especially with not having come from a circus family like so many people do, and having, grown up from it from the time he was born. He started late compared to many circus people. But yeah, he really was successful. I mean, I'm 29, and I certainly am not going to be managing my own anything anytime soon, much less an entire circus. So, the combination of Barnum and Bailey together. Barnum, if you weren't here with us last time, Barnum sort of signed on to circuses just for his name recognition. He was already famous before the circus, and then started to manage the show even beyond just his name recognition. But what happens is, in Bailey's circus, his elephants give birth to the first elephant ever conceived and born in the United States. So it was a huge deal. Press all over the place for this. And so Barnum, being Barnum, wants to buy it for his show. Bailey is very smart. Bailey, instead of selling the elephants to Barnum, uses this for advertising. And he says, hey, this is how great Barnum thinks my elephants are. He wants to buy them. So if they're that great, you should just come see him here, right? This was brilliant. People said that Bailey out-Barnumed Barnum because he was considered to be the king of advertising, basically. And so this essentially leads to the Barnum and Bailey partnership. Barnum really admires Bailey's sense of showmanship and advertising and that shrewd decision that he made. And so later in that year, they will join together. And I don't remember what that year is now, and I didn't write it down here. But we're talking about the 1890s, basically. So Bailey, again, is a shrewd and effective manager. He does great work with Barnum, too. And he will advance the Barnum and Bailey show in many ways. Theirs will be the first circus to introduce the use of electric lighting. And this is a big deal in part because the circus will be the first place that many Americans ever see electric lighting. Before it even comes to their towns or anything like that, they might see it at the circus first. Later in history, automobiles, it might be the first place they see an automobile too. The technology of the circus was really important. And then they also built a permanent winter quarters in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where Barnum was from. These were state-of-the-art buildings. They had heated barns for the animals, places with tracks to keep the railroad cars, a permanent training ring. This was really an amazing state-of-the-art facility, and Bridgeport sort of becomes associated with the circus, becomes quote-unquote circus city because of this. And there's a lot of other places in the U.S. that are circus cities too, but that's another lecture, more or less. So Barnum and Bailey becomes, they call themselves, the greatest show on earth, right? They are, or at least the greatest show in the United States, at very least, if not on earth. They are like no other entertainment thing you're ever going to see at that time. And I want to talk about the elephants again, and I want to talk about one elephant in particular, in part because his story is really fascinating, and in part because we're going to come back to elephants again later in the lecture. But we want to talk here about Jumbo the elephant, who maybe you've heard of. A lot of people have, even today, heard of Jumbo the elephant. Jumbo was one of the largest elephants that had ever been seen at the time. My understanding is he's still pretty far up there in terms of records. He was about 3¼ meters, or almost 11 feet high at his shoulders. I forget how many thousands of tons. This was a big, big African bull elephant. He was born around 1860 in Sudan, orphaned by elephant hunters who then sell the calf to an animal dealer, who then sells it to European facilities. Jumbo is kept in Germany and Paris as a young elephant before finally being sold to the London Zoo, which people assumed would be his permanent home. And he stays there for a long time, and Jumbo becomes very popular in England. Jumbo becomes something especially that school children look forward to going to the London Zoo to visit Jumbo. Well, for a couple of reasons, the keeper of the London Zoo ultimately decides it's time to sell Jumbo in 1882. We don't have to get into all the reasons why. Hello, Adam. But the decision to sell Jumbo and to Barnum and Bailey, who become the highest bidder for him, is an absolute outrage to the people of Britain. They are furious and sad, and 100,000 school children in England will write letters to the Queen begging her to stop the sale of Jumbo. You really cannot overstate just how important he was. And ultimately, it had to go to the courts, but the courts will uphold the sale. The contracts are legal, etc., etc. There's nothing they can do. And Jumbo becomes just as much of a cultural phenomenon in the United States as he was in England. Literally, what they call Jumbo mania sweeps the United States. You can buy all kinds of merchandise with his face on it. Again, people buy tickets to the circus far in advance to make sure they're going to get to see Jumbo. It's a really, really huge deal. Now, unfortunately, Jumbo meets an untimely end. Jumbo was killed in a railway accident in Ontario in 1885. The circumstances are still sort of mysterious. There are even some who say that Barnum may have orchestrated it on purpose. I don't think the evidence supports that. And actually, recent studies on the bones of Jumbo show that that probably isn't true. But regardless, however it happens, Jumbo is struck by a train and dies moments later. But Barnum saw no reason for that to mean that Jumbo would stop making him money. So he has the hide stuffed, the skeleton separate, and tours with the hide and the skeleton for people to see, which was still pretty remarkable. That's something most people would not have seen. The hide was donated to Tufts University, of whom Barnum was a major benefactor early on. Unfortunately, that hide was destroyed in a fire in 1975 that destroyed the entire Barnum Natural History collection at Tufts. The skeleton does still exist. It is held at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, and it was on display for quite some time. Right now it's in storage as far as I know. But Jumbo's skeleton is still held in a museum to this day. So again, pretty important cultural phenomenon. And again, we say Jumbo now because of this elephant. And we don't know for sure where the word Jumbo came from. It could have Swahili origins, but no one has quite deciphered that part yet. So that's the big rise of Barnum and Bailey. We need to also talk about the rise of Ringling Brothers separately. So if you weren't with us last time, the Ringling Brothers are 7 boys from Wisconsin, 5 of whom are the ones most involved in the circus. They just start their own sort of little backyard traveling show, doing juggling and playing the trumpet and little clown acts, almost like something you would just do for your friends, you know, today when you're a little kid, or with your friends. But it becomes really popular within just a decade, and they start growing a really big show. Over the decades, by the 1880s, they're traveling on the rails, and by the eve of the 20th century, by the 1890s, Ringling and Barnum and Bailey are now together the 2 biggest shows in the United States. And they're put in direct competition with each other. Now, one of the things that Ringling does to make themselves stand out is they promote themselves as extremely moral, extremely wholesome, extremely educational, and they make sure there's no gambling or drinking or anything else going on the show lots, either by employees or by patrons, by guests. And they end up getting the nickname the Sunday School Circus, which to some was a derogatory nickname, and to others was, it was a good thing, right? They took it in stride. That meant that the Ringling show was worth going to. So, they ultimately start competing for territory, in particular in New England and in parts of Canada, and they will agree to split contested territory for the most part, but this becomes really contentious. Sometimes they're following within days of each other, visiting the same city or town. They will put up posters that say, "Wait for the big show, wait for us," rather than seeing the other guy. And there will be some other forms of conflict too, and we're going to return to that idea of how the 2 circuses were competing with one another on a later slide here. So, again, Ringling continues to grow and to ultimately best Barnum and Bailey and also Buffalo Bill. So Barnum and Bailey, in order to try to fight back, purchases a controlling interest in the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. Buffalo Bill's business partner dies, and so he wants to sell interest in the show. The problem is Buffalo Bill's Wild West was not a circus in a lot of ways. But in practical terms, Buffalo Bill's Wild West was stationary. It didn't move every day like the circus did. It would stay in the same place for 6 months at a time. And so attempting to move Buffalo Bill's Wild West every day became a total nightmare, and that ended up being, although it was profitable, still a bad choice management-wise for Barnum and Bailey. Causes them a lot of headaches. So this ends up being more of an advantage for Ringling than something that's an advantage for Barnum and Bailey. And in the same year, which is 1896, when they purchased this Buffalo Bill's Wild West interest, Ringlings will begin to muscle in on the Barnum and Bailey territory in New England, like we just talked about. So what Barnum and Bailey will then do is leave for Europe. They will go on a European tour instead, and they'll be gone for 5 years. And ultimately, this ends up being a bad thing in many ways too, because the Ringlings now have free reign of what used to be Barnum and Bailey territory. So they're just kind of making decisions that end up being bad in hindsight, one after another. But one thing that is, sorry, I lost my train of thought for just a second. What was I gonna? So one thing that is good is Barnum and Bailey in Europe is a hugely successful tour, profit-wise at least. They tour, England and France, and you can see this poster here is in French, Switzerland, Belgium, all over the place. And no one in Europe has ever seen a show of this magnitude. Now again, there are some headaches for them. The European rail gauges are not the same, so they have to have their cars custom constructed, their train cars. The tunnels are different sizes, all kinds of things that are management headaches. But it is profitable. It's something that people go in droves to see. But they do end up losing territory in the US because of it. So, Barnum and Bailey returns to the States in 1903, and they are determined to have the biggest, best show they've ever had in order to compete with the Ringlings. And this leads to something called the Great Circus War. If you see this building in this picture is absolutely plastered every square inch with posters for the Ringling Brothers show. This is what they would call a billing war, where the shows would compete with putting up posters, essentially. Sometimes you would even plaster over your opponent's posters or tear them down, although that was considered bad form to do so, bad manners. It would happen anyway. And sometimes the bill posters would get in like knockdown, drag-out fights over putting up posters in these towns. And for many towns, it wasn't even worth the circus coming, they felt. They felt it was such a nuisance to deal with these posters everywhere that they almost didn't even want the circus there. Billing wars had been happening for decades, but this one was just particularly intense. Again, you can see this building here as evidence of that. But the other problem is, because this circus war becomes so intense, that leads to other problems, in particular increased labor activity, organized labor, or not really organized. Unions aren't involved for the most part. But the canvassmen who put up the tents will go on strike. The bill posters will make demands that will ultimately end up being met. The 1903 season in particular is what my dissertation is on, so I could go on about this forever. but I will leave it there just to let you understand the intensity of competition that's happening at this time. So finally, we're going to get to the combination of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey combined circus, greatest show on earth, that becomes the circus, right? It's the one that everyone knows. Some people don't even know sometimes that there is any other circus than this one. So this is a big deal. James Bailey will die in 1906, actually of a rare skin infection. It's kind of odd, his death. But ultimately then his widow will sell the show to the Ringlings the next year. And they will at first operate the Barnum and Bailey and their own original show separately. This allows them to cover more territory and to sell more tickets and to just ultimately, make more money, to keep them separate. But World War I comes along, and there's a labor shortage because of, soldiers off to war, or people, in factories and things making materiel for the war. And rail travel becomes complicated, right? Because the rails are being used for war purposes. So ultimately then, the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey shows will be combined in March of 1919. It will premiere at Madison Square Garden. And this is, if you ask any circus historian, they will tell you if they could see any show, it would be this one, the debut at Madison Square Garden. This show was massive. And the tour was massive. It was a literal army of people. 1,200 employees, over 700 horses, over 1,000 other animals, 100 double-length train cars. This was an undertaking like the world had never seen, except maybe in military terms. And actually, the military of the United States, of England, of France, of several countries end up going to study the circus. They will send their officers to study the circus, to travel with them, to see how they're able to move so efficiently. So it really, you can't overstate how big an undertaking this becomes. But this ultimately becomes a problem in many ways too. The work that's required to put on a show of this nature ultimately becomes more than the workers are able to bear under the conditions that they work in. This slide titled Happy-Hearted Roustabouts. If you have seen the film Dumbo, you know those roustabouts sing, you know, we're happy-hearted roustabouts, which they most certainly were not much of the time. But the circus performers, and not just performers, no wonder my leadership in the Army was a bunch of clowns. That's a good one. But yes, I mean, the Army actually learned a lot, not only about logistics, about moving people and equipment, even about like how to train animals, how to train horses. They would study from the circus. So, circus performers and laborers, I should have wrote. That's the most important part on this slide. All employees of the circus will unionize for the first time in 1937, all under the American Federation of Actors. Now, some employees had started to join unions before this. The horse drivers had joined Teamsters. Bill posters had joined the Bill Posters Union. But the vast majority of circus employees did not have any representation in organized labor before 1937. And this leads to a strike in 1938. Obviously, now that they have the ability and the support to strike for better conditions, they do so. This will be the first major strike since those events of 1903, but it is much more crippling. It actually shuts the show down halfway through the season. They have to completely stop and return to winter quarters. So what the show does then is they will send some of their biggest acts to other smaller circuses. Remember, I told you there are still some of those. But actually, Ringling owned those smaller shows too. Their names aren't that important. Algie Barnes, a couple of other names on these shows, but Ringling owned them all. So they could just send their acts, their animals and performers and things that were willing to work to these other shows. But this is ultimately the beginning of the end for the Ringling Show, although it's a long, slow decline that we will continue to look at here. But these labor troubles never really go away because putting on the circus is grueling. And so it's one of these things that will continue to haunt them in the coming years and decades. But there's also another really big tragedy around this time. Wanted to say you're awesome and your knowledge is great. Thank you. Sure do appreciate that. Thank you for being here. So, in 1944, we have the Hartford Circus Fire, which again, maybe you've heard of. Some people have heard of this. The circus had been crippled by World War II and also these labor troubles of recent years. It was not operating nearly as efficiently as it had, you know, in the decades before the unionization, and even back further than that. The peak of the circus really was right around the turn of the 20th century. Bad luck had become the norm. There were train wrecks and smaller circus fires. Things like this happened more often than you might imagine. And a big fire was a matter of when, not if. And the big reason for this is because canvas tents were waterproofed with a solution of paraffin wax dissolved in gasoline. So if that's not a fire waiting to happen, I don't know what is. However, I can understand the reasons that this was this way, because they saw rain as a greater threat than fire. Because most fires you could put out relatively quickly and were not a huge danger if they happened at all. They were small, you could handle them. But if the tent gets rained on, while it's up in particular, it can easily come crashing down. And so that would be, a huge, huge disaster and essentially inescapable, right? And not only that, but say it rains before a show, right? Moving a wet canvas, almost impossible. Thought of reaching out to a TV show and starting a show about random history facts. I haven't thought about that, but maybe I'll have my big break here on TikTok or Twitch or something like that. Maybe somebody will see me. But I appreciate your compliment. Thank you very much. So the canvas tents, again, they're more concerned about rain than fire, but ultimately a fire finally happens, and it is a huge blaze. At this show, there are approximately 7,000 people there. It's hard to know for sure. It's mostly women and children. And the problem is there's hysteria breaks out, as it does when there's a fire. And 2 of the exits of the canvas are blocked because they've just done the big cats, the lions and tigers, and so the chutes that are used to bring those cats in were blocking the exits. Some people also, it was the opposite of hysteria. They just sat there because they did believe the fire would be put out relatively quickly and it was better not to panic. So it was just a disaster in every possible way you could imagine. At least 167 people are killed in this fire. More than 700 people are injured. Chances are the numbers are greater than we know because the records may not have been kept. Some people attending the show may have been drifters who wouldn't have been reported missing. There were many people with minor injuries who simply didn't get treated. There are newspaper accounts talking about people just walking around in shock and not going to get treated. So the numbers are probably even greater. The cause remains unknown. Some people think it was just a cigarette that was carelessly tossed aside. There's some evidence and some people suggest that perhaps it was arson. There was a man who confessed to it but then later recanted. The truth is we don't know. But the circus never fully recovers, the reputation never fully recovers after this disaster. And the circus finally, in the 1950s, starts to become an object of nostalgia more than something that people are actively appreciating. In 1952, a film called The Greatest Show on Earth is made, directed by the famous Cecil B. DeMille. It will win 2 Oscars. It's nominated for 3 others. It's well received by critics, audiences alike. Everybody enjoyed this film, and I happen to think it's very good as well. It's got a lot of names, if you watch old movies, that you would recognize: Charlton Heston, Betty Hutton, Jimmy Stewart, big stars in this movie. And it actually used the Ringling show. They actually filmed Ringling acts and Ringling train cars, etc., etc. So it's a really good movie to watch if you want to sort of understand how people felt about the magic of the circus. And just a good film in general. In 1956, the circus will move from those canvas tents that it's been in since the 1820s into indoor sporting arenas. And this will lower those costs and get rid of a lot of those labor issues because you don't have to set up the canvas tents. You don't have to worry about a fire in the same way that you did before. But this will further diminish that popularity, right? Because being outdoors and being in those canvas tents is part of the experience of being at the circus. And so the circus sort of continues to decline and to become sort of more of an object of memory than something, of the present. Now we have the revival here with the Lords of the Rings, and I put that in quotes because that's not my title for them. That was in papers and magazines. The 2 brothers, Irvin and Israel Feld. These guys had been promoters for the circus for several years, and they ultimately in 1967 will buy the Ringling Circus outright from the last surviving Ringling family member. The brothers have all long been dead at this point, but a nephew, John Ringling North, is alive, as well as Henry Ringling North, two nephews, excuse me. And so the Felds will buy the circus from them, and they will revamp it to be something modern and new. The quote-unquote freak shows, the side shows are removed. Acts that are older and seen as less exciting are removed, and older stars, and I mean older as in often older people, who were stars, are all removed in an attempt to make the show new and to compete with, television and movies. Right, that's part of the reason that the circus is declining to begin with, is new forms of entertainment that are taking it over. And they will do a lot to bring the circus back to days of glory. They will establish Clown College, which will run for 30 years. Now, Clown College ultimately at some point became a joke, right? People say, oh, he went to Clown College. But being a clown is really hard work and quite a skilled art form. And so the Clown College was more difficult to get into than a lot of Ivy League schools and that kind of thing. Clown College was hard work and hard to get into, so not quite the joke that it got made out to be later. They will also open a theme park, a Circus World theme park in Florida, and that will run for a few years, but ultimately it can't compete with the other theme parks that are there. Disney World opens, Epcot, SeaWorld opens, etc., etc. And so Circus World will only be open for a few years before it closes. Why was it so hard to get into clown school? Essentially because it is such difficult work. You really had to prove your ability, right? You had to prove that you could do the work, both physically and that you sort of had the artistic skill, right? Some art schools aren't hard to get into, but some are, and this was one of them. Clowning is again a skilled art, for lack of a better term. It requires all kinds of coordination and stage presence and physical ability, right? So it was a big deal. Yes, I am on here. Hello again. Nice to see you here as always. Heavily safety and physically demanding. Yes, absolutely. And again, the presence required and the ability to improvise, right? A lot of times, one of the purposes of clowns is to be there in between, the bigger acts and to entertain. And also, the Ringling show would, for many years, have the clowns out before the show for you to interact with, right, and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different things you had to be able to do. And many clowns, of course, are people who can do more than one thing. They're clowns who are also jugglers or also acrobats or stilt walkers or what have you. They're people with multiple different types of skill sets. To this day, that's what it takes to be a clown. And I don't remember why the Clown College ultimately closes. I had that in my brain earlier today when I was reading, and I've since lost it. So I'd have to look up to remember why it closes. Wasn't sure I was coordinated enough. I understand that. I know that I'm not. Definitely not. The Ringling Circus will also tour Japan and Australia in the 1980s. They will start going on world tours again. And also, the Ringling show will split into two units. A red unit and a blue unit that will tour at the same time different areas. Again, kind of like it was before the split occurred before the join occurred with Ringling, Barnum, and Bailey, so that they could cover more territory. But still not completely at its former glory, but better than it was. In the meantime, a new sun rises, Cirque du Soleil, the Circus of the Sun, which is, in many ways very different. It has a lot in common with this, the traditional American circus, but it also is much more like the old European school of circus arts. Cirque du Soleil is founded in Montreal in 1984 by a former street performer named Guy Laliberté, is the best I'm going to pronounce that French anyway. Laliberté wants to still have that big spectacle, but he moves the circus toward being something that's more about contemporary visual art and about storytelling in particular. And he models it after the Moscow State Circus in Russia. A lot of countries have actual national state established circuses, and Russia's the big one. And in these circuses, in these contemporary circuses, storytelling is at the forefront of this, which is very different than these sort of disparate acts that just wow you with their spectacle. I can, but I'm not correcting you. That's very nice of you. Thank you. As a Texan who has never learned French, it's not my forte. But this quote here that Cirque du Soleil calls themselves animal-free, striking, dramatic, beautiful, reflective, right? It's something that is in many ways, you know, it's meant to be more introspective and something that makes you think, like being in a modern art museum, than sort of the low culture that some would associate the circus with being. I wouldn't, but some would. By the early 2000s, Cirque du Soleil has taken over the world. They have expanded to 19 different shows in over 300 cities on every continent except Antarctica that they've done. So it becomes huge, perhaps bigger than you would say Ringling ever had been. It really takes over. Now, Guy Laliberté will sell the show in 2015, and many will remark this to be the end of an era. The show very much changes without his involvement, although it had been changing already anyway. But the influence of these circus arts, of this contemporary circus, is still being felt today, and many people enjoy this. You know, these permanent Cirque du Soleil shows are something that people still go to now and really enjoy. But meanwhile, with Ringling, things are still on the decline, and elephants are very much at the heart of this. Just as elephants were at the heart of the rise of the circus, they are at the heart of its decline. There are changing perspectives over animal welfare and animal rights, which shockingly are different things, and depending on who you ask, one is more meaningful or better than the other. That becomes complicated. But regardless, the treatment of elephants in particular becomes a hot button issue in culture. PETA will begin protesting the circus on a major scale in the 1990s. They're founded in 1980, and by the 1990s is when PETA is really taking off. But PETA, of course, is a controversial organization, even to people who fight for animal welfare, in fact, to many of them. So PETA doesn't make as much ground as they would like because they are so controversial. But the Humane Society is much more respected, and the Humane Society will begin suing the Ringling Show for alleged abuse of animals. From 2001 to 2014, there will be a suit and a countersuit fought in court. The Ringling Show will ultimately win, quote unquote. They will win millions and millions of dollars in settlements. They ultimately end up with only one very small fine of a couple $100,000 from some incidents right in the middle of that time, right around 2008. The degree to which abuse was occurring is difficult to say. The fact that they were able to win in court means that certainly the court system did not see you know, that they were abusing animals to any serious degree, but the court system has been wrong sometimes. From what I know, in part from speaking to people in the inside, there certainly was abuse at times, bull hooks and electric prods, but it was not as often as was said by, you know, the people suing, and was not as extreme. I'm not going to pretend I really know what the answer is. The other issue is that some would say that keeping the elephants in captivity at all, training them by any method, is wrong. I'm not going to come down on one side of that or the other. I see both sides of that argument, and to put all my cards on the table, I do still attend circuses that still exist, including ones that have elephants and other animals. So that's ultimately where as much as I can come down one side or the other. Regardless, the elephants will ultimately be retired. Ringling finds that this is not worth the trouble to keep them, right, regardless of how they feel about it, and regardless of having won the majority of their court fights, right. And so in 2016, the elephants are retired. They're sent to the Center for Elephant Conservation, which is you know, a place that they had founded to already send elephants that were no longer performing anyway. Huge facility in Florida. And that facility even now is relatively well respected, because of course it's not like you can send these elephants back to the wild. They still have to have another home. But most agree that the Center for Elephant Conservation is a good place for them. So finally, the year after the elephants are retired, the curtain will come down for the final time on the Ringling Brothers show. Now again, this was, you know, more than 100 years, right? 120, 30 some odd years. I'd have to do the math now. But this show had been around a long time and had become a cultural institution. So this was a very sad moment for, certainly for the performers and the employees, and for, you know, the many people who had come to embrace the circus as something of nostalgia. But there weren't that many people who felt that way, more or less, because the ticket sales had been declining for a long time, even before the elephants retired. But the elephants retiring ended up being a bad thing for ticket sales, not good, because the people who were going to see the circus were the ones who were wanting to see elephants. So that ended up not working out for them. And in May of 2017, the Ringling Brothers show will give its final performance in Providence, Rhode Island. And that sort of seems like it's the end, right? But it isn't, not quite. The show must go on, as they always say. So where are we today with the circus? What's going on now? Well, the Feld Entertainment Company still retains the copyright to the Ringling name, and they still have some of the assets, although they sold a lot of them, especially the train cars. Rumors of a return of the Ringling show in some kind of new form are swirling around. I've heard so many different kinds of rumors of ways they could bring back the Ringling, maybe as a Cirque du Soleil type thing, or as just a smaller show that doesn't use animals or doesn't use elephants or something. I don't expect it to return anytime soon, but I expect they will find a way to use that name again someday in the future. I just don't think we're there yet. But Feld Entertainment became a huge company after buying Ringling, and they own and license a whole bunch of different traveling shows that are still very much popular, including Disney on Ice and Monster Jam, Monster Truck Show. They actually own a bunch of the on ice shows. So Feld Entertainment certainly is not going anywhere. There are also a handful of small, usually family-owned circuses that continue to tour the United States, mostly in the South from what I can tell, although I haven't dug too deeply into everybody's different routes. But the circus today is a much smaller affair, in many ways harkening back to the era of the mud shows, the wagon shows that we talked about in the last lecture. And I have attended several of these, including the Carson and Barnes show. And they take great pride in what they do. And some, like Carson and Barnes, have been around for decades. They've been around a long time and gone through a lot of ups and downs. But for some people, the circus is still very much alive. And circus schools are still thriving. Circus schools, which are essentially sort of athletic schools, right, teaching the circus as something for physical and mental enrichment, right? Circus psychology is a whole thing. There are not only circus schools, but schools that offer circus programs as part of what they do, both university level and primary. So, you know, acrobatics, juggling, et cetera, all these different kinds of physical arts are still very much alive. The show must and will go on in a lot of different ways, although it has changed quite a bit, especially since those early days of the 18th century circus that became what we recognize now. So, let me let you now know about next week's topic. We're going to talk about something else next week that I'm super obsessed with, and that is Ripley's Believe It or Not and Robert Ripley himself. That's one of the reasons I do what I do, is because I'm so obsessed with the novel, the unusual, the fun. I'll put it in Discord later. If you want some recommended reading, though, I can tell you this book, A Curious Man, The Strange and Brilliant Life of Robert Believe It or Not Ripley by Neil Thompson, is a great biography, and that's what I'm going to be working from for the lecture. Something else I also recommend a lot is the reprint of the 1929 original Ripley's Believe It or Not book. You can get this pretty cheap, and it's really cool to be able to look in and see like the original Ripley's cartoons and things from 1929. So those would be good to reference if you're looking for advanced reading. So we come now to the Q&A portion that I always like to have. Any questions, comments, or feelings? I'm expecting circus training just for sake of exercise like martial arts and such. Yes, it very much is something that's used for that. And in Sarasota, Florida, which is one of the big circus cities, because the Ringling held their winter quarters there for a while, they actually have like high school level circus programs, and they can get like their high school diploma in circus. It's really cool. Links in Discord. Yes, I'm going to put the books in Discord, so if you want to have a glance at those either before or after the lecture, you can do that. And the names of the books that I recommended on the circus are in Discord too. If you scroll back, they're in the Twitch channel on the Discord server somewhere. But yeah, so any questions or comments or anything you would like to address further? This is the circus history is what I'm getting my dissertation in, and I'm still not you know, a #1 expert, but I think I know more than the average Joe anyway. So hopefully I can answer any questions you might have. And if you don't have any questions, that's okay too. That just means that I covered it as well as I could hope, which is always the goal, right? All right, well, I am glad that you all joined me. As always, thank you very much for being here. It is really a pleasure to do these lectures for you. It's not something I ever planned on doing. And my students have to pay for the privilege, so. Aren't there circus camps for kids? Yes, there absolutely are, and that's that sort of same thing I'm talking about, right? Is it's a sort of a, for kids, it's like an extracurricular activity, like PE, right? Physical education. It's a physical and mental activity, because it not only, again, it's exercise physically, but the coordination that's required, right, to work together in circus arts is really important and very useful for educational purposes. Best of luck finishing my dissertation. Thank you. I'm working on writing it. I'm theoretically supposed to defend it in December of this year. We'll see how that goes. COVID slowed me down a little bit. Good luck. Thank you. I sure do appreciate it. So the next lecture will be 1 week from today, Sunday, 3 p.m. Central Time. I will see you all then. Thank you again for being here. Have a good afternoon, evening, whatever it is for you, and so long.